The summer of 1992 had been warm, the kind of heat that clung to the skin and made the air heavy with the scent of asphalt and pine. Along the interstate stretching through the American heartland, cars hummed endlessly, families returning from vacations, truckers hauling cargo, and solitary travelers drifting between destinations. Among them was a couple, Mark and Ellen, husband and wife, their sedan packed with luggage, maps, and the quiet residue of a long drive. They had been on the road for hours when Mark suggested they pull over at the next rest stop. Ellen, usually the more restless of the two, agreed almost with relief. The rest stop appeared like many others, a low brick building with restrooms, vending machines glowing faintly against the dusk, and a scattering of picnic tables shaded by tired oaks. The parking lot was not empty, but far from crowded. An assortment of vehicles stood scattered under the fading sun. Mark parked close to the main walkway, and Ellen stepped out first, smoothing her skirt, brushing strands of hair that the wind carried into her face. She was a woman of 32, with a quiet grace that made strangers glance twice, though she never seemed to notice. Mark remembered it as ordinary. Ellen said she would use the restroom and perhaps stretch her legs. He leaned against the car, fumbling with the road atlas, muttering about which route to take next. He did not watch her walk all the way into the building. He did not think he had to. But when several minutes passed and Ellen did not return, a small unease began to build. He folded the map, tapped his foot, glanced at the walkway. Still nothing. 10 minutes became 15. The unease thickened into impatience, then into something sharper. Mark finally pushed off the car and strode toward the building. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The tiled corridor was quiet, save for the faint sound of a hand dryer from the men's side. He lingered outside the women's restroom, awkward, unsure whether to wait or call her name. He asked a passing woman if she had seen Ellen, describing her clothes, her features. The woman shook her head, apologetic, and disappeared into the night. When Mark stepped back outside, his breath caught. The parking lot seemed emptier than before, as though in the short time he had been inside, several cars had slipped away. Their sedan stood exactly where it had been, his wife's handbag still in the front seat, the passenger door locked as before. But Ellen was gone. Not at the vending machines, not near the picnic tables, not by the trees at the edge of the lot. Panic pressed at him now, though he tried to resist it. He circled the rest stop twice, calling her name in a voice that trembled despite himself. He checked the restroom again, then the dim stretch of grass where cigarette butts and soda cans lay. He saw a truck driver adjusting his mirrors, a family corralling their children into a station wagon, a young man with headphones heading toward the payphone. None of them had seen her. None of them remembered her at all. By the time Mark approached the small service booth at the edge of the property, desperation had hardened into dread. He asked the attendant, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, if she had seen a woman matching Ellen's description. The attendant squinted, shook her head, and asked, "Was she with you?" Mark nodded too quickly. She went to the restroom. She never came back. The attendant's frown deepened, and for the first time, someone suggested what Mark had not wanted to consider, that perhaps he should call the police. The hours that followed became a blur, though Mark would recount them again and again over the years, each retelling slightly altered by memory and doubt. Officers arrived, flashlights sweeping through the brush and across the parking lot. They asked him questions, sharp and repeated, while radios crackled and patrol cars idled with their lights rotating. They combed the wooded edges, checked every stall in the building, questioned every traveler still lingering. But Ellen was nowhere. It was as if she had been erased in the span of minutes. By dawn, Mark sat on the curb with his head in his hands, staring at the car that had once carried both of them, but now felt heavier in its solitude. The first news crew had already arrived, camera lenses glinting in the pale light. The word "vanished" would be used before the morning ended, and it would follow him for the rest of his life. For now, he told himself, she must have wandered off, become lost, been picked up by someone she trusted. Some explanation would come, something reasonable, something that would return Ellen to him. But beneath that fragile hope lay a silence so vast it threatened to swallow him whole. Somewhere between the restroom door and the car, his wife had slipped beyond reach, leaving behind nothing but questions that would haunt every step of the years ahead. The sun was just rising when the search widened beyond the rest stop's immediate grounds. The orange light spilled across the highway, painting the patrol cars in muted fire as officers trudged through the brush with dogs straining at their leashes. The hounds barked into the tall grass, noses pressed low, circling, tugging, then stopping abruptly, confused by scents that began and ended in impossible ways. Tire tracks, cigarette butts, and discarded soda cups littered the ground, but none offered a definitive clue. Mark hovered near the car, answering the same questions in slightly different words. What time had they left their previous stop? Had they argued? What had Ellen been wearing? Did she carry anything with her? His answers repeated like a broken record. A blue blouse, a knee-length skirt, low heels, her handbag left inside the car. No, they hadn't argued, at least nothing unusual. Just the weariness of a long road trip, small disagreements about directions, nothing worth mentioning, nothing that could explain why she would vanish. By mid-morning, police had canvassed every traveler still lingering at the rest area. Some recalled seeing Ellen walk toward the building. A truck driver thought he'd glimpsed her near the vending machines, but when pressed, admitted he wasn't sure. It could have been any woman. A young mother swore she saw a figure matching Ellen's description, standing at the edge of the lot, but when asked to describe the details, her certainty faltered. Memory, it seemed, was already unreliable, crumbling under the pressure of questioning. Officers set up roadblocks on the highway shoulders, stopping cars, asking questions, showing Ellen's photograph to passing drivers. Flyers were printed by afternoon, her smiling face photocopied in black and white, the word missing in bold across the top. Within hours, the image began to appear taped on gas station doors, pinned to telephone poles, and handed to travelers at nearby motels. Mark watched all of this unfold with the disorientation of someone trapped in a nightmare that had slipped past waking. He followed officers into the woods, calling her name until his throat grew raw. He scanned each passing car, half believing she might appear in the back seat of one, trying to signal him. But each possibility dissolved into nothing. The sheriff, a man named Halverson, stood before him as the first day gave way to night again. He was heavy-set, with tired eyes that betrayed how many times he had stood in similar situations. "Mr. Klein," he said firmly, though not unkindly, "these cases are a race against time. If your wife left willingly, we'll find her trail. If something else happened—" He paused as though choosing his words carefully. "Then every hour matters. I need you to tell me if there's anything at all you haven't said." Mark shook his head almost violently. "I've told you everything. We stopped, she went in, and she never came out. That's it. That's all I know." Halverson studied him for a long moment. "You'll need to stay nearby. We'll keep you updated." The search continued late into the night. Helicopters scoured the woods with floodlights. Volunteers combed through ditches with lanterns, and local residents brought coffee and sandwiches to the exhausted deputies. Ellen's name was repeated like a prayer, echoing across the dark trees, but she did not answer. By the third day, suspicion had begun to creep into the edges of conversation. Officers asked Mark if his marriage had been troubled. They asked about debts, affairs, reasons Ellen might have wanted to leave him. They asked bluntly whether he had harmed her. Mark's temper flared, then collapsed into despair. He insisted he loved her, that they had been on a trip to visit her parents, that there had been no reason for her to vanish. Still, the questions circled back, persistent as gnats. Reporters gathered like vultures, microphones thrust into his face, their questions sharper than the officers. "Did you argue before she disappeared? Why didn't you follow her into the building? What do you say to those who believe you had something to do with this?" Each time his answers grew thinner, his voice weaker. On the sixth day, the official search scaled down. The helicopters left, the volunteers returned to their homes, and the deputies moved on to other duties. Flyers remained, fluttering on telephone poles in the wind already curling at the edges. For Mark, the silence of their departure was almost worse than the chaos of the search. It meant the world was willing to move forward, even while his had stopped. Yet not everyone gave up. Helen's parents arrived, their grief hard and unyielding. Her father, a stoic man with lines etched deep into his face, walked the rest stop grounds for hours, retracing her last known steps. Her mother sat at the picnic table near where Ellen had been seen last, staring at the building as if her daughter might walk back through its doors at any moment. On the seventh night, Mark stood alone near the payphone, listening to the highway hum in the distance. The shadows of trucks slid across the lot, headlights carving temporary paths of light. He thought about how ordinary it had been, how harmless the decision to stop had seemed. Just a restroom, just a moment's pause before continuing on. And in that pause, in that ordinary slice of time, everything had been stolen. The search had begun, but already Mark sensed the truth, that this would not be solved quickly, if at all. That Ellen's name would drift further from the lips of strangers, that the flyers would fade and tear, and that he would remain, marked forever as the man whose wife vanished in the span of a bathroom break. And somewhere, he thought, clutching the cold steel of the payphone stand, Ellen was either out there, alive but beyond reach, or buried in silence. Her voice lost forever. The mystery had only just begun. By the second week, the case was no longer just a local tragedy. It had become a headline. Newspapers across the state carried Ellen's photograph on their front pages, her smile captured forever in the kind of portrait usually reserved for yearbooks or family mantles. The story's hook was irresistible to reporters. A wife vanishes at a rest stop. Husband says he doesn't know what happened. It was the kind of mystery that readers devoured over breakfast and commuters dissected on talk radio. At first, Mark was portrayed as the grieving husband. His tearful pleas in front of cameras, his visible exhaustion, his insistence that Ellen must have been taken, all of it drew sympathy. But sympathy is a fragile currency, quickly spent. As the days stretched into weeks without progress, journalists began to circle back with sharper edges. They noted small inconsistencies in his timeline. Had it been 10 minutes or 15 that Ellen was gone before he looked for her? Had he heard anything unusual or hadn't he? In interviews, his voice wavered, his memory blurred, and what the public wanted was certainty, not the grey fog of confusion. Talk shows speculated. Some guests insisted it was a case of abduction, a woman stolen in the anonymity of the highway. Others leaned into darker theories, that Ellen's disappearance had been orchestrated, that the husband knew more than he admitted. A host on late-night radio asked his audience bluntly, "If your spouse disappeared while you were only a few feet away, wouldn't you notice something? Wouldn't you hear something? Wouldn't you see something?" Callers flooded the lines with theories, judgments, and suspicions. The whispers reached into Mark's everyday life. At grocery stores, strangers glanced at him, then quickly away. Some whispered as he passed. Others stared openly, as though memorizing his face in case it appeared later beneath a damning headline. At work, colleagues spoke to him with careful neutrality, avoiding any mention of the case while still carrying the air of people who had already decided what they believed. Ellen's family was no less divided. Her sister, Margaret, visited Mark once and sat across from him in silence, eyes sharp and unreadable. She finally asked, "Are you sure you've told the police everything?" The question landed like a knife. When he bristled, she didn't argue, only stood and left, saying quietly, "If you're innocent, you have nothing to fear." He never saw her again in person. From that moment, she kept her distance. Ellen's parents, however, remained convinced of his sincerity, at least outwardly. Her mother clung to him in grief, repeating that Ellen would come back, that she must come back. But her father's eyes told another story, a cold watchfulness, as though he were studying Mark for cracks. Detectives continued to probe. They asked about finances, about debts Mark had incurred, about a woman he had once been seen with before his marriage. Each question dug at him, not just because of suspicion, but because of how easily fragments of his life could be arranged into a damning picture. Yes, he had some debts. Yes, he had known another woman years ago. Yes, he and Ellen had argued, like any couple did. Each yes was true, and yet each one was a nail in the coffin of public opinion. It didn't help that Ellen herself seemed to vanish too cleanly. No credit card use, no bank withdrawals, no sightings. If she had run away, she had done so with impossible precision. If she had been taken, there was not a trace. And if she had been harmed by the man she trusted most, then perhaps the lack of evidence was itself the evidence. The story spread like wildfire precisely because it had no resolution. Only questions that bred more questions. By the third month, Mark found himself alone in the house they had shared, the silence louder than any accusation. He stopped answering calls from reporters, stopped going out except for necessities. He told himself he was waiting for the phone to ring with news, waiting for Ellen to walk through the door. But waiting was also hiding, from the police, from the public, from the shadow that had grown around his name. One evening he found himself parked outside the rest stop once more. The lot was nearly empty, the same brick building standing under the weight of fluorescent light. He sat in the car staring at the walkway Ellen had taken. He imagined her figure moving again into the restroom, imagined her coming back out, waving at him, smiling at his impatience. He whispered her name aloud, softly like a prayer, as though speaking it might conjure her back. But the lot remained still, and the night air pressed against the windows. Somewhere between midnight and dawn he realized with a cold clarity that Ellen was not simply missing. She was gone. Whether she had chosen to leave or been taken, the result was the same. The woman he loved had stepped out of his reach, and the world had placed him under a shadow that would never lift. And yet, in the quiet of that rest stop, Mark also felt something else, a question that would not die. If she had left by choice, why leave her handbag in the car? Why leave so much of herself behind? It was a small question, one easily lost amid louder suspicions. But for Mark, it became the beginning of an obsession, one he would carry for years. In the months that followed Ellen's disappearance, the Klein and Whitmore families became locked in a painful dance of grief, suspicion, and barely veiled hostility. At first there had been unity. Vigils held together, shared prayers, public appeals for information. But as weeks turned into months and then a year, cracks began to widen, exposing divisions that could not be healed by shared loss. Ellen's parents, Thomas and Ruth Whitmore, carried their grief in different ways. Ruth clung desperately to hope, speaking of her daughter in the present tense, refusing to accept the possibility of death. She kept Ellen's childhood room exactly as it had been, fresh flowers on the nightstand, curtains drawn back to welcome light. She wrote letters addressed to her daughter, filling them with everyday details, as though Ellen were merely away and might soon read them. To Ruth, the possibility that her daughter had walked willingly away from her life was unthinkable. It had to be an abduction, a cruel twist of fate. Thomas, by contrast, wore his sorrow like armor. He was stern, rigid, and increasingly convinced that answers would never come. His belief in justice was steady, but so too was his suspicion, of strangers, of passers-by, and most of all of Mark. He never accused outright, but the air between them thickened with unspoken doubt. Every time Thomas looked at his son-in-law, Mark felt himself being weighed and measured against a standard he could never meet. Ellen's sister, Margaret, grew sharper with time. Unlike her parents, she stopped attending the vigils and declined interviews. Instead, she became something else entirely, an advocate for skepticism. In private conversations and quiet whispers at community gatherings, she suggested that Mark knew more than he admitted. "It doesn't make sense," she would say, voice low but firm. "You don't lose a woman in the space of 10 minutes. Not unless you're hiding something." Her words traveled, passed along in careful tones, until they reached almost everyone in town. For Mark, each interaction with Ellen's family became a battlefield. Ruth's fragile hope both comforted and pained him, because her belief in Ellen's return forced him to maintain the same illusion, even when his own hope had begun to falter. Thomas's quiet judgment was harder still, leaving him defensive without reason. And Margaret's thinly veiled accusations cut deepest of all, echoing the suspicion already brewing in the public sphere. The fractures widened beyond family. Friends of Ellen divided themselves into camps, those who believed Mark had been unfairly targeted by rumor, and those who believed he had crafted a careful facade. Church groups argued in hushed tones after services. Co-workers gossiped in break rooms. Each side became entrenched, not because they had evidence, but because they needed certainty in the face of a mystery that refused resolution. The police, too, had shifted their stance. While officially the case remained open, detectives stopped calling with updates. When Mark reached out, they answered politely but with little urgency, as though his voice had become just one more reminder of an unsolvable puzzle. They had moved on to fresher cases, to crimes that offered tangible evidence. Ellen's file remained thick, but dust began to gather at its edges. It was during this time that Mark made his first major mistake. In an effort to escape the suffocating scrutiny, he began spending evenings away from home, driving long stretches of highway, lingering at diners, occasionally drinking more than he should. One night, he was seen leaving a bar with a woman who was not his wife. Though nothing lasting came of it, the sight was enough. Word spread quickly, and before long whispers turned into something sharper. "See?" people muttered. "He's moved on. He's not grieving. He's guilty." When Ruth heard the rumors, her faith in Mark wavered for the first time. She confronted him, her voice trembling with both sorrow and rage. "If you love her, how can you look at another woman? How can you even think of it while she's still out there?" Mark's defense, his loneliness, his desperation for human connection, fell flat. For Ruth, it was betrayal layered atop tragedy. For Thomas, it was confirmation of his doubts. Mark retreated further, isolating himself, speaking less, avoiding public gatherings altogether. He stopped answering the phone when reporters called. He stopped attending vigils. He let the house grow quiet and untended, dishes piling in the sink, grass overtaking the lawn. What once had been a shared home became a hollow place, haunted not by Ellen's presence, but by the absence of her voice, her laughter, her very breath. Still, every night he lay awake, asking himself the same questions. What had he missed? What detail had he overlooked in those minutes that mattered? Was there something Ellen had tried to tell him before they left home? Something buried in her last words, her last look? The fractures within the family mirrored the fracture within himself. Everyone was breaking apart, scattered by the weight of a mystery that refused to give way. And yet, even in the silence, even in the loneliness, Mark could not silence one thought. If Ellen had been taken, someone knew the truth. Someone had seen her. Someone had crossed paths with her in those final minutes. But 15 years would pass before that someone's shadow would resurface. By the end of the first year, the investigation into Ellen's disappearance had lost the urgency that once propelled it forward. The headlines grew smaller, buried deeper in newspapers, then disappeared altogether. The television crews that once crowded the rest stop, sticking microphones into Mark's face, drifted away to fresher stories. The detectives who had once promised updates began to call less frequently, until months passed with no word at all. The rest stop itself became just another anonymous patch of concrete on the highway, a place where strangers pulled over for coffee and gas without ever realizing the weight of what had happened there. The trail had gone cold. The police file grew thicker with every tip that led nowhere. Letters came in from people across the country who claimed to have seen Ellen in bus stations, airports, diners. She was said to be in California, in Florida, even across the border in Mexico. Each lead sent investigators chasing shadows, only to return empty-handed. Witnesses contradicted one another. Descriptions blurred. Every new sighting raised hopes, only to crush them again. The passage of time did its cruel work. Ruth Whitmore's desperate hope began to look fragile, almost delusional, even to those who loved her most. She continued to keep Ellen's room the same, continued to write her letters, continued to set aside a seat at family gatherings. But each passing year left her thinner, her eyes dimmer. Thomas, meanwhile, hardened further into silence. He no longer spoke of finding answers. He no longer spoke much at all. His grief had calcified into a stern endurance, and when he looked at Mark, his suspicion no longer needed words. Margaret moved on in her own way. She married, had children, and built a life, though she never spoke Ellen's name to them. To her, the mystery was poison, and the only way to survive it was to cut it out. Yet even as she tried to close the door, her occasional comments, slipped into conversations with friends, whispered over the phone, kept suspicion alive. "I'll never believe it was random," she once said, her voice sharp. "You don't vanish at a rest stop unless someone close to you wanted it that way." For Mark, life became a cycle of survival rather than living. He kept his job, though he worked mechanically, avoiding co-workers who still eyed him with quiet curiosity. The house remained in his name, though he wandered its rooms like a ghost, unable to decide whether to preserve Ellen's things or pack them away. Some days he left her belongings untouched. Other days, in a fit of anger or despair, he stuffed boxes with her clothes and photographs, only to pull them back out in the middle of the night. Guilty and trembling, the police had long since shifted their focus, but they had not forgotten entirely. Every few years, a new detective was assigned to look through the file, re-examine evidence and make calls. Each time the same conclusion emerged. There was nothing new, no angle left untested. The file would be returned to its shelf, waiting for some spark that never came. The community too moved on. New tragedies replaced old ones. New gossip took the place of lingering speculation. The rest stop was remodeled. Fresh paint covered the brick. New lights were installed. The vending machines replaced. For most travelers, it was just another place to stretch their legs. Only for Mark and for Ellen's family did the place remain marked, a scar on the landscape. 15 years passed. The world changed in ways both large and small. Technology leaped forward. Cell phones became common. Social media began to shape lives. Mark aged quietly, his hair graying at the temples, his shoulders bending under the weight of years without resolution. Ruth died before she could see any answers, still clutching her belief that her daughter would come home. Thomas grew quieter still, and Margaret's resentment turned into distance. Ellen's name faded from most conversations. But not for Mark. For him, the mystery remained as sharp as it had been on that first night. He still woke in the dark hours before dawn, hearing her voice in dreams, reaching for her in the empty space beside him. He still drove past the rest stop sometimes, though he no longer parked. He could not bring himself to walk its grounds again, but the sight of it through the windshield was enough to twist his stomach with dread and longing. And then, in the spring of 2007, something shifted. A man named Carl, who had just won a storage unit auction in a small town 2 counties away, began sorting through boxes of old clothes, faded photographs and forgotten furniture. Among them he found a worn leather bag. Inside were ordinary things, notebooks, receipts, a pair of sunglasses. But as he dug deeper, he found items that carried a different weight: a driver's license, a ring and a diary, each bearing the name Ellen Klein. The bag had been lost to time, locked away in storage, waiting. Its rediscovery would pull the case back into the light. And within its pages, Ellen's own words would breathe again, carrying secrets that no one had expected. The trail had gone cold for 15 years. But now a single bag threatened to unravel everything. The spring of 2007 arrived without ceremony. For most, it was an ordinary season. Children running in parks, families cleaning out garages, small towns shaking off winter with festivals and fairs. For Mark Klein, it was simply another year passing, another stretch of time measured by silence. He had grown accustomed to living quietly, unnoticed, drifting through routines that gave structure but no meaning. He no longer expected answers. He no longer expected Ellen. But fate has a way of pulling the past back into the present when it seems most forgotten. The man who purchased the storage unit at auction, Carl Dorsey, was not looking for mysteries. He was looking for bargains, furniture to resell, tools he might use, the occasional forgotten collectible. He had attended dozens of auctions before, always drawn by the hope that someone else's abandoned belongings might carry hidden value. The unit he won that April was like any other, cluttered with cardboard boxes, an old mattress, lamps with frayed cords. It was in the corner, beneath a stack of blankets, that he found the leather bag. Time had darkened the material to a deep brown, the stitching frayed but intact. When Carl unzipped it, the smell of old paper and dust wafted out. Inside were objects that seemed ordinary at first: notebooks with scrawled handwriting, receipts from gas stations long since closed, a small case of makeup. But then came the driver's license, the name clear: Ellen Marie Klein. Carl paused. He did not know the name immediately, but something about it nagged at him. It was only later, when he mentioned it to his wife, that she remembered. Wasn't that the woman who disappeared years ago? The one at the rest stop? They had her face all over the news. Curiosity turned to responsibility. Carl contacted the local sheriff's department. Within days, detectives were at his home, sifting through the bag with latex gloves, carefully placing each item into evidence containers. They examined the sunglasses, the wallet, the folded letters, and then they came upon the diary. Its cover was worn, the pages yellowed but legible. Written in neat cursive, the entries carried the voice of a woman long silent. When word reached Mark that Ellen's belongings had been found, he sat in stunned disbelief. For 15 years there had been nothing. No trace, no object, no sign. And now all at once here was a piece of her, a tangible connection to the life she had lived before the silence. He drove to the sheriff's office, heart pounding, palms slick with sweat. The detectives laid the items out before him on a table. His breath caught when he saw them, her handwriting on the diary's cover, the familiar scratch of her notes in the margins, the way she had tucked receipts into the back pocket, just as she always had in her purse. Her ring, sat in a small plastic evidence bag, glinting faintly beneath the fluorescent lights. Mark reached out instinctively before remembering the barrier of procedure. "This was hers," he whispered. His voice cracked. These are hers." Detectives exchanged careful glances. For them, the discovery was more than just emotional. It was evidence. A trail that had been cold for 15 years now carried the faintest warmth again. The question, however, was how the bag had ended up in a storage unit 2 counties away. Who had placed it there? And why had it never been found before? They began tracing the unit's history. It had passed through several owners, rented under different names over the years. Records were incomplete, payment receipts faded. It was a dead end in some ways, but not entirely. The unit had once been registered to a man whose name appeared more than once in Ellen's diary. A name circled in ink, underlined in a way that suggested significance. The detectives did not tell Mark this immediately. Instead, they asked him about the man. Did he know him? Had Ellen ever spoken of him? Mark frowned, struggling to recall. The name stirred something faint, a half-remembered conversation, but nothing concrete. He shook his head, feeling the weight of his failure. How many times had Ellen tried to tell him something he had brushed aside as unimportant? How many signals had he missed? The diary itself became the centerpiece. Its entries were ordinary at first, small observations about the weather, frustrations with long drives, fleeting mentions of family visits. But scattered among them were hints of unease. "I think he followed me again today. Mark doesn't notice, but I feel watched. Why won't he leave me alone?" The detectives read these lines with mounting interest. They were not proof, not yet, but they were a voice from the past pointing in a direction no one had considered before. For Mark, the diary was a wound reopened. He read her words late into the night, his chest tightening at the glimpses of her private fears. She had been afraid. She had been trying to tell someone, maybe even him, and he had not seen it. The discovery of the bag changed everything. What had been a closed chapter was now a reopened case file, thick with fresh urgency. Reporters once again appeared, microphones ready, hungry for a new angle. The Whitmore family was contacted, their grief stirred anew. Margaret, bitter but unwavering, declared, "Maybe now the truth will finally come out." For the first time in 15 years, the silence surrounding Ellen's disappearance cracked. And within that crack, light and shadow both began to seep through. The bag had been hidden away for a reason. Now that it had surfaced, the truth it carried would not remain buried much longer. The diary was not thick, its spine worn, its cover softened by use, but inside its pages, Ellen's voice lived again. Her handwriting, small and careful, carried the rhythm of someone who recorded not for show but for clarity, as if the act of writing steadied her thoughts. At first, the entries seemed mundane, notes about dinners with her parents, remarks on weather during road trips, fragments of conversations she wanted to remember. But as detectives and later Mark read further, a second thread began to emerge, subtle at first, then insistent, then undeniable. Ellen had been afraid. It began with small notations, easy to overlook. Saw him again by the market, or car parked too long across the street. At first, these lines seemed like fleeting worries, the kind everyone experiences when shadows linger in the corner of ordinary life. But as the months of entries unfolded, the mentions multiplied. "Why is he always there? I don't want to tell Mark yet. He'll say I'm imagining things. He waved at me today, smiling like it was a game, and then abruptly a name appeared, written once, circled, then again underlined, and again scrawled in the margin of an otherwise unrelated page. Victor." The detectives traced the name with gloved fingers, their eyes sharpening. "Do you know anyone by that name?" they asked Mark, placing the diary before him. He stared at it, throat tightening. Victor. The name was not entirely unfamiliar. Somewhere buried in memory, he recalled Ellen mentioning it once in passing, though whether as a co-worker's acquaintance, a distant friend, or someone she had seen in town, he could not remember. He shook his head, frustration rising like heat. "She never told me. She never said she was afraid of someone. But the diary contradicted him. Helen had been documenting weeks, perhaps months of unease. She described footsteps behind her when she walked to her car at night, a figure in a truck that seemed to follow her on errands, a phone call with silence on the other end. She wrote about her growing fear that Mark would dismiss it, chalk it up to nerves or imagination. And so she wrote instead, capturing her dread in ink rather than voice. One passage struck both Mark and the investigators hardest. Dated 3 weeks before her disappearance, it read, "I think I know what he wants now. It isn't me, not really. It's what I saw. But I can't prove it, and Mark would never believe me. Maybe I should tell Margaret. Maybe not." The detectives leaned in, parsing every word. What had she seen? What was Victor after? Why keep silent? As they worked, reporters once again descended. News outlets seized upon the revelation of the diary, splashing excerpts across screens and pages. "Wife left clues in her diary," one headline blared. "Who is Victor?" asked another. The public, who had nearly forgotten Ellen, became enthralled again. Talk shows debated the meaning of her words. Was Victor a stalker, a lover, a phantom invented by fear? Mark found himself pulled back into the spotlight he had spent years trying to escape. Once again, microphones crowded him as he left his home. Once again, questions cut through the air. Did you know about Victor? Did your wife ever confide in you? Do you believe she was being stalked? His answers were halting, raw. I didn't know. If I had known, I would have protected her. I would have done something. But the doubt in the reporter's eyes told him his words landed without conviction. For Ellen's family, the diary stirred emotions as tangled as they were painful. Ruth was gone now, but Thomas read the entries with grim silence, his jaw tight. Margaret, however, was quick to seize on them. She was afraid, she said to a journalist. She was leaving a trail in case something happened. And look who she didn't trust, Mark. She didn't tell him because she knew he wouldn't believe her. The words cut deep, reopening wounds between them. The detectives, meanwhile, dug deeper. They scoured records for men named Victor, who had been in the area at the time. They revisited old witness statements, trying to match the vague figure seen at the rest stop with Ellen's words. They even traced the storage unit's history again, and here the trail grew darker. At one point in the mid-1990s, the rental had indeed been under the name Victor Hale, a man with a record of petty theft, minor assaults, and connections to small-time criminal dealings, Victor Hale. But when they searched for him in 2007, they found he had died 6 years earlier, a quiet death in another county. His trail ended in a forgotten grave. For some investigators, that was the end. A suspect gone, the truth forever buried with him. But for others, the fact that Ellen's bag had surfaced after so many years, containing not just her belongings but her own words, meant there was still more to uncover. Because while Hale was dead, the storage unit had lived on, passed through multiple hands. And someone somewhere had chosen to keep that bag hidden. Mark, sitting in his darkened living room, read her words again and again, tracing each line as if the movement of his finger could bridge the years between them. She had been afraid, and she had carried that fear alone. The name Victor rang in his head, heavy as a bell tolling in the distance, and though the man was dead, Ellen's words still pointed somewhere. Somewhere unfinished, somewhere waiting to be found. The discovery of Ellen's bag, her diary, and the name Victor brought the long-dormant case roaring back to life. What had once been a closed file collecting dust was now reopened with urgency. A new generation of detectives tasked with piecing together a puzzle that had sat unsolved for 15 years. Detective Laura Hastings was among the first to take the file from the shelf. Young enough to have been a teenager when Ellen vanished, she had grown up hearing about the rest stop wife case in passing. Now, with the bag in evidence and the diary on her desk, she felt the tug of something both professional and personal. Hastings was methodical, not easily swept away by headlines, but as she read Ellen's words, her careful descriptions of unease, her circled notes about Victor, she felt a quiet indignation. This woman had been afraid and no one had listened. Hastings would not let that happen again. She began by combing through every original witness statement, treating them not as static records, but as threads to be tugged. The truck driver who thought he'd glimpsed Ellen near the vending machines, The young mother who swore she'd seen a woman matching her description at the edge of the lot, the attendant in the booth who had suggested calling the police, all were tracked down if still alive. Some remembered little. Memory fades after all. But others, when pressed, revealed fragments that hadn't made it into the original reports. The truck driver admitted he'd also noticed a man lingering near the payphone, but dismissed it at the time. The young mother recalled faintly a car with out-of-state plates leaving quickly. Each sliver, once insignificant, now glowed under the light of Ellen's diary. Hastings pushed further, examining the storage unit records. The name Victor Hale surfaced again and again, but so too did other names, aliases perhaps, or renters connected by tenuous threads. One in particular stood out. The unit had, for a brief time, been paid for in cash by an associate of Hale's, a man known to police for moving stolen goods. The possibility arose that Ellen's belongings had been taken not as a trophy but as part of something larger, a piece of leverage, or a secret meant to stay buried. Meanwhile, Mark found himself once again at the center of scrutiny. Detectives questioned him about the name, about whether Ellen had mentioned Victor in passing. His insistence that he remembered nothing sounded hollow even to him. He replayed every conversation he had ever had with her, every car ride, every dinner, every whispered goodnight. Had she tried to tell him? Had he brushed it aside? The guilt gnawed at him, sharper now with her words preserved in ink. The Whitmore family, too, was pulled back into the orbit of the case. Margaret attended the first press conference after the reopening, her voice firm as she told reporters, "This is our chance to finally know what happened to Ellen. We deserve answers." Her father, Thomas, stood beside her but spoke little, his face lined with grief too old to disguise. For him, hope was a dangerous thing, but duty to his daughter's memory pulled him forward. As weeks passed, Hastings and her team unearthed more details. Old phone records revealed that Ellen had received several calls from payphones in the months leading up to her disappearance, all untraceable at the time. But now, with fresh eyes, Hastings noted something chilling. One of those calls had been placed from the very rest stop where Ellen vanished. It was enough to sharpen the focus. Ellen hadn't simply stumbled into danger by chance. She had been watched, followed, perhaps even lured. Reporters descended once more, their stories laced with the newfound urgency of the reopened case. "Rest Stop Wife Mystery Reignites," one headline read. "Diary points to stalker named Victor," another declared. The public devoured every update, once again hooked by the chilling simplicity of the story. A woman vanished in the space of minutes, and now, years later, her own words whispered from the grave. For Mark, the pressure was unbearable. His neighbors looked at him differently again, not with curiosity this time, but with pity. Some even offered quiet apologies for having doubted him so openly years before. But pity did not soothe him. What he wanted was Ellen, her presence, her laughter, her voice. Instead, he was left with her diary, a bag of belongings and a tide of questions that only deepened his regret. One night, unable to sleep, Mark drove once again to the rest stop. It had been renovated since that night, brighter lights installed, new landscaping hiding the old cracks in the pavement. But as he parked and sat in silence, he could still see it as it had been, the dim building, the scattered cars, Ellen's figure walking away. He whispered her name into the night, just as he had years before. The silence answered, heavy and unbroken. Back at the sheriff's office, Hastings traced her finger across a photocopy of the diary, stopping at a line Ellen had written. "He doesn't just watch. He waits. For what, I don't know." The words were not just a record of fear. They were a warning, and Hastings believed they were closer now to knowing what Ellen had seen, what she had discovered, something that had bound her fate to a man named Victor, and to whoever had hidden her bag for all those years. The case was open again, and with it the past refused to stay buried. The old case files were brittle with time, their pages yellowed and stiff, but Detective Laura Hastings read them with the kind of attention that made the past breathe again. She lingered on the eyewitness accounts, the fragments of memory collected on that night in 1992, hurriedly scribbled into reports. For years those details had been dismissed as inconclusive. Now, with Ellen's diary as a key, the fragments began to align. One report in particular drew her eye. It was from a long-haul trucker named Sam Rowe. At the time, Rowe had said he noticed a man hanging around the payphone, smoking one cigarette after another, not making a call. The man was tall, wiry, with a scruffy beard, and he seemed to be watching people more than using the phone. Rowe had thought little of it. Rest stops attracted drifters, after all. But Hastings underlined the passage. Ellen had written of someone who waited, someone who appeared in places she didn't expect. Rowe was still alive, retired now, living in Arizona. Hastings tracked him down by phone. His memory wasn't perfect after 15 years, but when she read him the notes, there was a pause. "Yeah," he finally said, voice gravelly with age. "I remember him now. I didn't think about it much then, but he wasn't there for the phone. He was there for people, watching, you know the look." Another witness, a young mother who had been traveling with her children, recalled something similar. She told Hastings that when she pulled out of the lot, she had seen a car parked near the edge, headlights off. In the driver's seat sat a man who leaned forward as if hiding. She hadn't thought to mention it at length back then, distracted by her kids. But now, pressed for details, she remembered the car clearly. Dark, older, with plates she believed were not from their state. Piece by piece, the image of the stranger at the rest stop took shape. Tall, watching, possibly driving a dark sedan with out-of-state plates, the kind of presence that, in hindsight, was too deliberate to ignore. Hastings placed these testimonies against the backdrop of Ellen's diary. The name Victor Hale loomed again, a man with a record of petty crimes, known for drifting from place to place. She ordered a fresh background check, and the results only deepened her conviction. Hale had been sighted near that very highway in the summer of 1992, only weeks before Ellen vanished. The connection was circumstantial but unsettling, and yet Hale had been dead for years. That fact haunted Hastings. If he was responsible, the case would never see justice. But if he wasn't alone, if someone else had been with him, someone who had kept Ellen's belongings hidden, then the story wasn't finished. For Mark, the news of the reopened witness accounts landed like a blow. He read the newspaper articles that described the man at the payphone, the dark car, the out-of-state plates. The words blurred as he thought back to that night. He had stood in the lot pacing, calling Ellen's name. He had seen headlights flicker across the trees, but he hadn't looked closely. He hadn't thought to. His failure to notice, to pay attention, now felt like a wound reopening. Margaret predictably seized on the details for her own narrative. "Even if this Victor was involved, it doesn't erase Mark's failure," she told a reporter, her tone sharp. She trusted him to protect her, and he didn't. Her bitterness spilled into the press, fueling public debate once more. Some sided with her, arguing that Mark's negligence had doomed his wife. Others defended him, insisting he was a victim too. The case became less about Ellen herself and more about blame, a spectacle that drew attention but offered no closure. Hastings, however, pushed forward. She requested crime scene photos from the night of Ellen's disappearance, long stored in evidence. As she studied the grainy prints, she noticed something almost invisible, a cigarette butt near the payphone marked but never tested. In 1992, DNA technology had been limited, and no one had pursued it, but in 2007 it was a different story. Hastings sent it to the lab, her pulse quickening with the possibility that it might tie the stranger to a name. Weeks passed before the results came back. The DNA on the cigarette matched Victor Hale. It was both a breakthrough and a dead end. Hale had been there. He had stood by the payphone watching, waiting. But with his death 6 years earlier, justice seemed out of reach. Still, the discovery raised new questions. If Hale had been responsible, why had Ellen's bag been kept hidden for so long, only to reappear 15 years later? Why had it passed through so many hands, as if someone else had taken responsibility for keeping it out of sight? One night, Hastings sat alone in her office, the diary open before her. The word Victor circled again and again. She flipped to one of the last entries Ellen had written. He was at the rest stop too. "I knew he would be, but I didn't tell Mark. He'd never understand." Hastings closed the book slowly, the words settling over her like a weight. Ellen had recognized him. She had known he would be there, and if she had known, then perhaps her disappearance had not been random at all. Perhaps she had carried a secret to that rest stop, one that had cost her everything. The image of the stranger lingered, half-formed but unmistakable. Hale had been there. The question was who else had been waiting in the shadows. The name Victor Hale had given the case a face, but the more Detective Hastings dug, the more she felt the man was only one thread in a larger weave. Ellen's diary hinted at it. Her cryptic line, "It isn't me, not really. It's what I saw." That sentence gnawed at Hastings. What had Ellen witnessed that could have tied her fate to Hale and possibly to others? The answer began with money. Hastings assigned an analyst to comb through financial records from the early 1990s, not just Ellen's but also Mark's and the businesses connected to both families. What emerged was a pattern of small but curious transactions linked to a hauling company that operated along the same highway corridor. The company's books were littered with inconsistencies, payments made for transport fees that never matched delivery logs, large sums withdrawn in cash with no trail. And among the signatures authorizing some of those transfers was one name that froze Hastings mid-page: Mark Klein. It wasn't proof of guilt. At the time, Mark had been helping manage finances for a construction supply company that occasionally used independent haulers. He could have signed those papers without realizing their true purpose. But the link was there, undeniable. And Ellen, careful and perceptive, might have noticed it too. When Hastings questioned Mark, he looked bewildered at first, then defensive. "I signed what I was told to sign," he insisted. "I wasn't looking at every decimal point. I was keeping the business afloat. Ellen never said a word about it to me." But his words faltered when Hastings placed the diary before him, showing the passages where Ellen had mentioned being followed, where she had written of transactions that don't make sense. The realization struck him with sickening clarity. Ellen had seen the numbers, just as Hastings suspected, and she had understood something he hadn't, that there was more behind those papers than business errors. Digging deeper, Hastings found Hale's name again, connected to the hauling company through a string of low-level workers. He had once been employed to drive shipments, though records showed he was fired after a theft investigation, yet his name surfaced again in connection to side jobs, under the table runs, cash payments. If Ellen had stumbled onto irregularities, Hale might have been ordered, or perhaps simply motivated, to silence her. But then came another layer, darker still. A phone record buried in the old evidence revealed that Mark himself had received a call from Hale's number 2 weeks before Ellen's disappearance. Mark had forgotten it. 15 years is long enough to erase a single call, but the record didn't lie. Hastings showed it to him, and his face drained of color. "I don't remember," he said, shaking his head. "I swear I don't remember him calling me. Maybe it was a wrong number," but Hastings wasn't convinced. Whether Mark remembered or not, the tie existed. Hale had reached out to him, and Ellen had written of someone circling her life like a shadow. Margaret seized on the revelation with fury. "She knew," she told reporters, voice cracking with a mix of triumph and grief. "My sister knew he was hiding something. She knew he was lying, and that's why she's gone. Don't you see? It was never random." Her words lit a fire in the public once more, dividing opinion between those who believed Mark was an unwitting pawn and those who believed he had orchestrated everything. Meanwhile, Hastings pressed on. A retired detective, who had once handled the original case, recalled an odd detail. During the initial search of the rest stop, officers had found a crumpled sheet of paper near the trash bins. It bore a string of numbers like a ledger. At the time, it seemed irrelevant. But looking back, it matched the kind of notations found in the hauling company's financial discrepancies. The paper had gone missing from the file years ago, misfiled or discarded, but Hastings now suspected it had been Ellen's, perhaps torn from notes she had kept separately from her diary. The pieces painted a grim picture. Ellen had seen something in the finances, something that pointed to illegal dealings, cash moving off the books, perhaps even smuggling disguised as legitimate hauling. She had connected those dots to Hale, a man who lingered in her orbit like a shadow. And on that night in 1992, when Mark thought they had stopped at the rest stop by chance, Ellen may have known exactly what was waiting for her. For Mark, the weight of revelation was unbearable. He had spent 15 years haunted by the image of his wife walking away into silence, believing it was fate or coincidence or some cruel twist of chance. Now he was forced to confront the possibility that Ellen had been keeping secrets, secrets that touched his own work, his own signature. his own life, and that she had vanished not just as his wife but as a woman who knew too much. In the dim light of his kitchen, he opened the diary once more, staring at the final page. Ellen had written, "If anything happens, remember this isn't about love or marriage. It's about what I saw. And if I disappear, it will be because of it." He read the words again and again, until they blurred, until his hands shook. For the first time, Mark wondered if his wife's disappearance had been set in motion not just by Victor Hale, but by the fragile threads of betrayal that had been woven into his own life without him ever noticing. And somewhere in those tangled threads, the truth was waiting. Detective Hastings read the diary again late into the night, her office lit only by the glow of the desk lamp. She lingered on Ellen's last entries, her words tight, hurried, as though written with the weight of urgency. "It isn't me. It's what I saw. Mark doesn't realize, and I don't want to frighten him. But it's close now. Too close." Hastings had been chasing this shadow for weeks, trying to piece together what Ellen had seen. The numbers in the hauling company's books, the phone records connecting Hale to Mark, the missing crumpled ledger page, all of it pointed towards something larger than an isolated crime. And then, in the bottom of the bag that had been pulled from the storage unit, she found a folded piece of paper Ellen had tucked between 2 pages of the diary. It was covered in Ellen's handwriting, columns of numbers, place names, and dates. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than receipts, maybe notes for a household budget. But as Hastings lined them up against the trucking company's financial irregularities, the pattern sharpened. Each date corresponded with a large cash withdrawal from the company accounts, followed by a run logged under special transport, and each place name, small towns, highway stops, and warehouses, sat along a smuggling route that had been quietly investigated by federal authorities in the early 90s. Ellen had uncovered it. She hadn't meant to stumble onto a conspiracy, but her eye for detail, her habit of writing everything down, had led her to see what others ignored. And once she saw it, she became dangerous. The realization hit Hastings like a cold wave. Ellen had known. She hadn't just been stalked by Hale, she had been silenced because she carried knowledge that could unravel more than one man's livelihood. When she confronted Mark with the paper, his face collapsed. "I never looked at those numbers," he whispered. "I signed off because I trusted the books. I thought it was routine." His voice cracked as he looked down at his wife's handwriting. She knew. She saw what I didn't. But Hastings pressed him further. Why would Hale, a small-time criminal, have been tied to a scheme involving thousands of dollars? Who else had known? Who else had wanted Ellen quiet? The answer emerged not from Mark, but from old business records. Ellen's notes contained one more clue, initials scrawled in the corner. TW. At first, Hastings thought it was coincidence. Then the truth struck. Thomas Whitmore, Ellen's father. The revelation sent ripples through everything. Thomas had once held quiet stakes in the very company where Mark worked, a fact long obscured by shell records and minor partners. He had invested heavily, and the suspicious withdrawals aligned with his involvement. What if Ellen had discovered not only Hale's crimes, but her father's connection to them? Mark refused to believe it at first. "Thomas would never—" he began. But even as he said it, the silence that had always defined the man, the cold watchfulness, the way his suspicion had always turned on Mark, took on a new, chilling clarity. Perhaps Thomas hadn't doubted his son-in-law because of what he believed, but because of what he knew. Perhaps suspicion had been a shield, a way of deflecting attention from himself. Hastings pursued the lead carefully. Thomas was old now, his health failing, his voice brittle with age. But when she questioned him, the guardedness in his eyes told her enough. He admitted to having invested in the company, yes. He admitted to knowing Hale in passing, yes. But every denial beyond that was too rehearsed, too brittle. And when Hastings showed him Ellen's notes, his hand trembled as he reached for them, his jaw tightening with unspoken recognition. It was then Hastings realized the true depth of Ellen's tragedy. She had been caught between forces far greater than she understood. Criminal dealings hidden behind the face of her own family, men like Hale who enforced silence, and the quiet complicity of a father who may not have ordered her disappearance, but had turned a blind eye when his secrets risked exposure. For Mark, the knowledge was unbearable. He had spent 15 years drowning in guilt, believing he had failed to protect his wife, that he had been blind to her fears. Now he saw that her silence had not been about mistrust of him, it had been about shielding him. She had chosen not to tell him what she saw because she knew the danger it carried, and she feared dragging him into it. She had carried that burden alone until it consumed her. The last diary entry made sense now, its words more chilling than ever. If anything happens, it will be because of what I know. And if they take me, Mark must not blame himself. He must not. Mark wept when Hastings read it aloud, but he also clenched his fists, a fire stirring in him for the first time in years. He wanted the truth laid bare, not just for Ellen, but for himself. For all the years he had been crushed by shadows that weren't his to carry. Yet even as the truth began to crystallize, Hastings knew they were missing one final piece. The bag had carried Ellen's notes, yes, but there had been something else. Something deliberately hidden, carefully stitched away, that had escaped notice during the initial search. When the technician brought it forward, a small cassette tape found lodged in the seam of the bag, Hastings felt her heart lurch. 15 years of silence, and now Ellen's own voice was about to speak again. The cassette tape was small, no bigger than the palm of a hand, its label blank, the plastic scuffed from years hidden inside the lining of Ellen's bag. A forensic technician had found it only after noticing an uneven seam, carefully stitched and deliberately concealed. Whoever had hidden it there had not meant for it to be discovered quickly. It was Ellen herself who had tucked it away. A final insurance against being erased. Detective Hastings and her team set up an old player in the evidence room, the kind that still had wheels capable of turning magnetic tape into sound. Mark was present, his hands trembling, unable to sit still as the machine clicked and whirred. The room filled with static at first, a hiss of time pressing against silence. Then slowly a voice emerged. It was Ellen. Her tone was low, hurried and tinged with fear, as though she had recorded the message late at night, when the house was quiet and her thoughts too heavy to bear alone. "If you're hearing this," she began, her voice catching slightly, "then something has happened. I don't know how much time I have, or whether I'll even get the chance to explain in person. But I need someone, anyone, to know what I've seen." She paused, and the shuffle of paper could be heard faintly, as though she had the same notes later found in her bag. "I found numbers that don't make sense. Payments that shouldn't exist. The hauling company is being used for more than supplies. There's cash moving off the books, and I think it's tied to something much bigger. Shipments that aren't what they say they are. I don't know what's inside the trucks, but it isn't construction materials. I think it's drugs. Or weapons. Maybe both." The room grew still. Hastings exchanged a glance with the technician. Mark pressed a hand against his forehead, whispering, "My God." Ellen's voice continued, quicker now, as though she feared being interrupted. I recognized one of the names connected to it. "Victor Hale. I've seen him watching me. He knows I noticed. He wants me scared, and it's working. I think he followed me home once, but I didn't tell Mark. I didn't want him involved. I didn't want him hurt. Hale isn't working alone. I think Dad knows something. He was at one of the offices the same day the money moved, but when I asked him about it, he brushed me off. I can't tell if he's protecting me or protecting himself, and I'm afraid of the answer." A long pause followed, filled only by the crackle of the tape. Then Ellen's voice softened, breaking with emotion.
"Mark, if this ever reaches you, please know I didn't keep it from you because I didn't trust you. I kept it because I love you. I thought if I carried it alone, I could shield you. If anything happens, remember it wasn't your fault. I chose this silence. But I think Hale is going to make sure I never speak again. If you're hearing this, then he succeeded." Static swallowed the last words, the tape ending abruptly, as though cut short. The room remained frozen in silence. Hastings leaned back, the weight of the recording pressing on her chest. Mark sat hunched, tears sliding down his face unchecked. For the first time in 15 years, he had heard his wife's voice again. Not as a memory, not as a ghost, but as the woman she had been, frightened yet resolute, carrying a truth that had cost her everything. The tape was more than a confession. It was evidence, proof that Ellen had uncovered a smuggling operation, that Hale had been circling her life, and that her father, Thomas Whitmore, had been connected to it. While it did not reveal exactly what happened at the rest stop, it pointed clearly to why. Ellen had not vanished by chance. She had been silenced. News of the tape sent shockwaves through the community. Reporters seized on every word, plastering headlines across television and print. Missing wife's tape reveals smuggling secrets. Father implicated in daughter's disappearance. Public opinion, once fractured, now sharpened into outrage. For years, people had speculated, doubted, whispered. Now they had Ellen's voice, clear, trembling, undeniable. For Hastings, the tape was both a breakthrough and a burden. It confirmed suspicions, but left no definitive proof of Ellen's fate. Hale was dead. Thomas Whitmore denied everything, his denials brittle but immovable. Without a body, without direct evidence tying one act to the other, justice remained elusive. For Mark, the tape was a cruel salvation. He wept as he played it over and over, clinging to her words, hearing again the cadence of her voice. But each replay also broke him further, because woven into her message was the unshakable truth. She had walked into danger alone, carrying the weight of love as both shield and sacrifice. The discovery of the tape closed the door on speculation. Ellen had not run away. She had not abandoned him. She had been silenced for what she knew. And yet, as Hastings stared at the bag, the diary, the tape, she could not shake one final question. If Hale had taken Ellen, what had he done with her? And if Thomas Whitmore had been complicit, how far had his silence reached? The final chapter of the story was waiting, just beyond reach. And when it came, it would reveal the truth of that night at the rest stop. Once and for all, the cassette tape had shifted the case from speculation to certainty. Ellen's own words, preserved in fear, confirmed what investigators had only suspected. She had stumbled onto something she was never meant to see, and men like Victor Hale had been waiting to ensure she never spoke of it again. Yet even with her voice on tape, one question remained like a splinter under the skin. What exactly had happened to her that night at the rest stop? Detective Hastings refused to leave the case half-finished. She combed once more through the records of Hale's known associates, through the business ledgers, through Ellen's notes. Patterns emerged, names that overlapped, dates that coincided, addresses where trucks had been parked. Then one lead sharpened into focus. A warehouse off the highway, owned at the time by a shell company tied to both Hale and, indirectly, to Thomas Whitmore. It had long since been sold and repurposed, but in the early 1990s, it had been a hub for cash-only operations. Hastings tracked down a man who had worked there, now in his 70s, and pressed him for details. His memory faltered, but under the weight of the diary excerpts and the tape, he admitted what he had never told police. "That night," he said slowly, "I saw Hale pull into the lot. He wasn't alone. A woman was with him. Looked frightened. I didn't stick around. I didn't want trouble, but I never forgot her face. When I saw the news later, I knew it was her." The testimony broke the case wide open. Ellen had indeed been taken from the rest stop. Witnesses had seen fragments, shadows of the truth, but now it was clear. Hale had not acted on impulse. He had been waiting, and when Ellen stepped out of Mark's sight, he seized his moment. What happened after remained harder to pin down. Some said Hale had delivered Ellen to the warehouse. Others believed she had been moved again, hidden away until she was gone for good. No body was ever recovered, no grave uncovered. But the testimony, combined with Ellen's diary and her tape, painted the outline of a tragedy too sharp to ignore. For Mark, the revelation was both devastating and clarifying. The doubts that had haunted him for 15 years, the whispers that he had been involved, the gnawing guilt that he had failed her, were stripped away. Ellen had not left him, nor had he betrayed her. She had walked into danger because she was brave, because she had refused to stay blind to corruption. And he, blinded by routine and trust, had missed the signs. She had carried the weight for both of them, and she had paid the price. When Hastings confronted Thomas Whitmore with the final pieces, his silence spoke louder than denial. He admitted nothing, yet the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes fell when she mentioned his daughter's name, revealed more than words could. He had been tied to the smuggling, yes, but whether he had ordered Hale to silence Ellen, or whether Hale had acted alone to protect the larger scheme, remained unclear. Hastings suspected Thomas had known, had suspected at least, that his daughter's disappearance was no accident. And yet he had chosen to bury his guilt in silence, to carry the facade of suspicion against Mark as a shield for himself. The truth, then, was not neat. It was jagged, incomplete, built on fragments of evidence and the echo of Ellen's own voice. There would be no trial for Hale. There would be no confession from Thomas. What remained was the certainty that Ellen had been silenced because she had known too much, and the enduring grief of those who loved her. The case closed with words that felt both heavy and hollow. Probable abduction, linked to organized criminal activity, victim presumed deceased. It was a conclusion without a body, a verdict without full justice. Yet for Mark, it was enough. Enough to clear his name, enough to silence the whispers, enough to finally understand that Ellen's last act had been one of courage, not betrayal. On the 15th anniversary of her disappearance, Mark drove once more to the rest stop. It had been rebuilt since those days. New brick, fresh paint, brighter lights. Families came and went, children laughing, travelers stretching their legs before continuing their journeys. To them, it was just another stop on the endless highway. Mark stood near the walkway, where Ellen had last been seen. He carried the diary in his hand, her handwriting alive beneath the cover. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, quietly, he whispered into the evening air, "I hear you now, Ellen. I hear everything." The wind rustled through the trees at the edge of the lot, carrying the faintest scent of pine and asphalt. And in that moment, Mark felt something he had not in 15 years. Not closure, exactly, but clarity. The truth had been unearthed. Not whole, not perfect, but enough to honor the woman who had vanished between one breath and the next. Ellen had been silenced, yes, but through her words, her ink, her hidden tape, she had spoken louder than those who tried to erase her. And that voice, fragile yet unbreakable, would echo long after the highway lights dimmed.